Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And what a busy week it has been. Whoever knew that a balloon could cause so much ruckus in the United States? And did Xi know about this balloon and what it was supposed to do? Or worse, did he not? Then we'll take a look at the latest in Ukraine. A Russian offensive seems to have begun to recapture some of the territory lost during the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians. Missiles continue to be striking the territory of Ukraine and overflying now overnight Moldova. And then the extraordinary tragedy in Turkey and Syria, where an earthquake, actually two earthquakes, have now led to at least 20,000 people killed. That number is bound to rise as the rubble begins to clear. What are the implications for politics in Turkey and the humanitarian situation both there and in Syria? Here to talk about all of these issues today are Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who is the China reporter of Axios. She's in Houston, but normally based in Taipei. Bethany, great to see you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me again.
And also here, Stefan Kornelius, political editor of Süddeutsche Zeitung. He's in Munich. Great to see Stefan back.
Wonderful to be with you.
And Giles Whittell, world affairs editor, Tortoise Media, joining us from London. Great to see you. Bethany, let's start with you. I guess the big question is, what did Xi Jinping know and when did he know it when it comes to this balloon, which has now been identified by the U.S. government officially as a surveillance balloon?
Yeah, what a week it's been. I woke up on Saturday morning last week in Taipei, which is 13 hours ahead, and I looked at the news and I felt like an entire spy movie had happened overnight while I was sleeping. It was just wild. And so, to me, surprising how it had captured the imagination and just the whole country really was transfixed. So I think that it's, there's several key points here. And from pretty much the beginning, and now we're seeing some reporting to support this, it was my sense that we had two separate things going on, that we had this diplomatic track, Blinken's about to, head to Beijing for an important visit. The first time in 6 years that a Secretary of State will have visited China after, several carefully coordinated meetings and virtual meetings over the past months to lay the groundwork for this, important U.S.-China meeting here. And then we have this security, incident of this surveillance balloon, not just sort of brushing, into U.S. airspace, but actually floating over the entire continent, in open view of just average Americans. It's a public relations disaster, a diplomatic disaster. I think it's very easy from a distance, due to a lack of transparency and due to a lack of knowledge, to view the Chinese government as a perfectly functioning, well-oiled machine where Xi Jinping knows everything that's happening all the time. And it could not be further from the truth. That is not how any government functions, and especially not how the Chinese government functions. It's really important to know that the Chinese security apparatus spans different agencies, different branches of the government. There's the PLA, there's the Ministry of State Security, there's, and then there's the weather people, and then there's all the ties that all these different agencies have to the MSS and to the PLA. There's so many moving parts. And with a surveillance program like this, we now know that this has been a years-long program by the Chinese government to develop to blend an old technology of balloons with new uses in terms of surveillance. We now know they've deployed this, to multiple countries over the years. We didn't know that a week ago. It's really important to remember that it is very unlikely that Xi Jinping or top officials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or literally anybody at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, knew about this program or knew that it was happening right now. And the people in charge of it, who were running it, we're not even sure who that was at this point, but the company that made the balloon, we do know now has direct ties to the PLA, that they may not have been thinking in terms of a Blinken visit. Or if they had, they may have just thought it wouldn't matter, because this is not the first time that a balloon has infringed on over U.S. Sovereign territory. It's not the first time that balloons have been sighted by people in Taiwan and Japan and other places. So they wouldn't have had, the people in charge of it on the military side wouldn't have had any reason to think this would become a diplomatic incident when it never had in the past. My guess is that there was just a total breakdown in communication between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Xi Jinping himself and the military side of things. Now, that's understandable, but it's deeply problematic in our current global situation, in which we basically have some sort of a Cold War. Ties between the two major superpowers are very tense. Things are just almost spinning out of control. Both sides are kind of desperately trying to put a bottom on it. President Xi, General Secretary Xi Jinping, needs to have a better handle on what his spies are doing and what his military is doing when, and to have a sense of how that's going to influence, diplomatic relations. I'll just make one more additional point about this, which is a little bit not exactly unrelated, but on the U.S. side, we also have had some pretty, harmful reactions to this. Now, it is totally fine to be alarmed. This is a very clear infringement on U.S. airspace and sovereign territory. It's really egregious. When there are spying incidences between between countries, I mean, every country spies. Everybody knows everybody spies, but things can spin out of control when it's very public and very egregious. And in this case, it was both public and egregious. But on sort of the right-wing side in this country, there was an overreaction. We had J.D. Vance, a newly elected senator, tweeting a photo of him pointing a gun at the sky, and we have people calling for criticizing Biden over it, saying his reaction wasn't good enough, saying we should have shot it down immediately, and basically becoming this almost a Dr. Strangelove-esque kind of panic. That is also extremely unhelpful. Clear minds need to prevail in this situation, and that's what both sides really need to work on: is being clear, communicating clearly, and not overreacting.
Bethany, I think you lay it out exactly right. The disquiet about what do people know in China, and what does it say about the possibility of things running out of control, the overreaction, which is, I think, the only way you can describe it, in certain parts in the United States. I mean, the degree to which this captured the imagination of Americans, maybe explained the other day. We were driving, I'm in Palm Springs in California, driving, and saw a hot air balloon in the distance. And I said, first thing I thought was, that's a Chinese balloon. It took me about a nanosecond to think that, no, actually, a lot of people do hot air ballooning in this part of the world. But it's sort of part of it. And Stefan, I just wonder, sort of on all three parts of what Bethany talked about, the sort of the U.S. imagination reaction, was that the same? Would it have been the same if in Europe, or an understanding the worry or concern about what's happening with Xi and his control of the country, and then the worry that two sides are at it to find a race to the bottom or a race to confrontation, rather than figuring out how to solve these kinds of issues? Because after all, as Bethany said, the fact that spying is going on is not a new thing in international affairs.
Well, indeed. And I think that kind of mismatch of means and counter means, the way the political debate was conducted in the US, the heatedness of public reaction, all those outcries of nationalists, of sort of patriotic joy almost, by shooting down a balloon. I thought, from watching that from Europe, it was a bit puzzling, quite honest. Yes, there needed to be a message sent to Beijing that this is not acceptable. But I think the European reaction would have been totally different, for the lack of leverage, probably, because most Europeans neither would dare confronting China that way, because that definitely would spin out of control. An interesting fact to me is that in Europe right now, you actually see the opposite. There is a kind of charm offensive coming in from China. The foreign minister will travel to Europe next week. He will spend time in Brussels. There will be actually the governor of Xinjiang coming to Brussels in about 10 days' time for 3 days. An extended visit. Nobody knows what he really wants. I mean, he's sectioned, actually. He couldn't travel to the US. He can still travel to Europe. So there is a huge political discrepancy in how to react to China and how to read all of this. To me, this all sounds like there needs a lot of transatlantic talk to be done to straighten things out, to basically get on one line again. And I wouldn't condemn Americans' outrage for at all, but probably a rather better nuanced mix of means and less shooting would have done the deal as well. And my guess is, that foreign minister traveling to Beijing now would quite have some stories to tell, or would have some leverage to put onto the Chinese and to confront them with something. So let's see whether Tony Blinken will use this opportunity. On the European side, that the China interest is disappearing, is waning a little bit there, because I guess for this continent here, taking on two major crises at the same time seems pretty much overburdening. And we'll talk about Ukraine in a minute, but right now I think we're totally overstretched with the one crisis right next on our borders.
Giles, how do you see this? I mean, add anything you want to what Bethany and Stefan said, but also specifically, you do get this sense that both sides are so stuck in how to think about each other that the reaction, I mean, the first reaction in China actually was regret, but immediately led to a switch there as well when it didn't lead to any change in American behavior. And you do have this worry that the fact that no one is talking to each other, both inside governments, but also between governments, the risks of miscalculation, of accidents, of escalation in the wrong direction really does go up.
Yes, but at least we may be more aware of those risks now than a week ago. I mean, these two key questions, what did she know? How much communication or lack thereof was there within the Chinese government and security apparatus, but also, as you say, back channels, did they become clogged between China and the US to the extent that this was a total surprise? If there's a potential breakdown there, we are definitely more aware of it now than we were a week, 10 days ago. I'm reminded, partly because I'm very old and partly because I wrote a book about it, of the U2 affair, when, as you will remember, Ivo probably, the Russians shot down a U2 over Sverdlovsk in May 1960. The cover story then, as now, was initially a weather expedition. Eisenhower was required initially to stick with it. And the only salient point I think that's worth raising about that now is that ultimately it was Eisenhower who was the more embarrassed, not Khrushchev. And I think for all the fact that Biden has some little local political difficulties over the time it took him to shoot it down and that kind of thing, ultimately it is Xi who has more questions to answer. To Bethany's points, I instinctively agree, as we put in England, that cock-up is more likely than conspiracy. And let's remember, this is a balloon. It was not steerable. It was pure chance that it floated, largely chance and computational analysis of meteorology, that it drifted right over northern Montana and the missile silos. But it would be wrong, I think, to impute too much kind of time-related malign intent there, because nothing has changed about those missile silos in decades, really, as far as we know. And so I would definitely, as I say, favor a cock-up theory of this over conspiracy. But I think to a lot of people, including me, Bethany's analysis that Xi really, it's almost certain that he didn't know what was going on, will be alarming.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, Stefan, please.
Just to add one point, I would suggest that, I mean, we don't know the details. I do read that these balloons are a bit steerable, and it might not be an accident that they were hovering over those silos, because the Strategic Command obviously just has changed its communication ways it does its communication on the digital sphere. So to pick up those signals, to decipher them, to find out how the new way of communicating works needs some hovering over it, which things satellites can't do. So there might be an interest, but that's basically second reading from other sources. I honestly don't know, but I wouldn't underestimate the Chinese desire to do some spying. I mean, the amount of its spying here in Europe is just breathtaking. The dozens and dozens of diplomats which are sent into regional consulates to disappear in some basements for weeks and to do some listening attacks on my and your cell phone. It's breathtaking.
Bethany, please.
Yeah, you mentioned the U2 incident. This also reminds me a lot of the Hainan Island incident in 2001, which was a major diplomatic crisis between the U.S. and China. And what happened briefly in that case was it was a U.S. reconnaissance plane that was flying close to Chinese airspace, but not in Chinese airspace. And a Chinese jet fighter intercepted it. And something happened. The two planes collided, and the Chinese plane crashed and the pilot died. And the US plane was forced to make an emergency landing on Chinese soil. It had 24 crew members. And so China held the crew members and interrogated them, and of course had stripped the plane of all the surveillance equipment. But it was a huge issue in between the people, not just between the governments, between the people of China and the people of the US. And at the time, there was a similar obsession on both sides of, everybody became an expert in reconnaissance planes. Everybody became an expert in the relative nimbleness of jet fighters versus spy planes and who was at fault. And the Chinese people blamed America for sending a spy plane so close to China. American people blamed the Chinese fighter for messing it up. He was the one who should have been, better, and also blamed China for holding 24 Americans. And so it became this issue of deep, profound resentment between your average Joe, like in Kentucky, and your average, Xiaoming in Henan or something. And that, even though that incident was resolved through very careful, diplomatic planning and language and stuff over several months, it lasted between the people. And if I was in China in 2004, people were still talking about it. And I think that's really important to understand. This isn't, that this isn't just an issue between governments. It also builds the sense of distrust and righteous indignation and injustice between, two groups of people. And that is harmful and dangerous. And on the Chinese side, we have censorship and propaganda that inflames it and makes it worse, because right now, Chinese people believe that this was a civilian airship, that it was just gathering, information about the weather, and that the U.S., with no reason, shot it down. And that's really harmful. So there's also this sort of popular level of resentment and distrust that builds.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important part of how to think about it, and it just raises the stakes. And I'll give one more sort of example that we can look from history that we're worried about, which was a U.S. surveillance plane overflying the Soviet Union just during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the worry that would lead to. On the Russian side, or the Soviet side, was going to be seen as the beginnings of an attack at a moment of incredible crisis. And when you have this popular outrage that exists between societies, and then you don't have communication between governments other than informal, I go to the ambassador, and nothing bad about ambassadors, certainly not ours in the US. But if that's the only forms of communication, apparently Secretary Austin tried to have a conversation with his Chinese counterpart, and they didn't answer the phone. If that happens, then the tendency to think the worst and to act on the basis of worst case analysis, as opposed to how do we resolve this, increases, and that's how you get to confrontation and conflict and possibly war. And the thing we learned in 1962, the U.S. government and the Soviet government, was that confrontation was too important and too scary, that you needed to start to talk to each other, which is where the hotline came from in 1963. And a whole variety of things. And we've been trying to do this with the Chinese now since the Hainan incident, trying to establish military to military and the civilian to civilian connections, and it's not working. In fact, the first thing that the Chinese cut off after the Pelosi visit last year was all contact between our two governments. And if you don't talk to each other, you're going to be driven by, I think, Bethany, the passions of the moment, rather than the reality of the situation we face. It's scary. Potentially scary. I don't think it is in this particular case. I think it will be controlled, but I do hope that saner minds prevail on both sides, including Stefan's point of having Blinken soon coming to Beijing to start figuring out how you can improve the situation is a good measure. But if he does, we will be here to talk about it. In the meantime, let's talk about other crises. And Stefan, you already mentioned how Europe is consumed by the crisis in Ukraine. A really big week with a visit by Zelensky to all major European capitals, or at least meeting with major cabinet, major leaders. And then the start of what the Ukrainians have long said would happen, a Russian offensive in the east. Bring us up to date about where we are and what you think is ahead, Stefan.
Right. Well, it's exactly about those two things: diplomatic and military advances on all fronts. Militarily, it's quickly said the Russians seem to have launched their so-called spring offenses. It's not spring yet in Ukraine, but the soil is still frozen, which makes an advance by heavy weapons much easier. Obviously, there seem to be new weapons being deployed. The T-90s are now at the front at a much higher number, as we have seen them last year. And two divisions, fully equipped and well-trained, or better trained at least, as the previous ones, seem to be operative now in the southern Donbas region. There has been heavy shelling and rocket assault from the Russian sides again. So it looks like the first phase of the military advance is again one of terror and destruction. It's not really aim-driven. It's not really hasn't reached the point where they broke through the lines of the Ukrainians, but that seems to be a matter of probably days and weeks. On the other side, the Ukrainians are not enjoying the kind of equipment which was promised to them. The time was not long enough now to deliver all the heavy weaponry which was promised, mostly the tanks from the Europeans. And this is where it all switches into the political sphere, where Zelensky this week was doing the rounds in Europe for the first time since the war broke out. This was basically necessary since he went to Washington before, and all the other European allies needed the assurance that they would be first thanked and second sort of brought into the game again. And that's also in the interest of Zelensky to rally the allies. And his first stop was in London. And what we found out is that that stop probably wasn't really well communicated with other European capitals. So when the French found out the same day that the first stop was in London, meeting the Prime Minister and the King, and talking at the Houses of Parliament, there was a flurry in Paris to basically get Zelensky over for a late dinner in the Élysée Palace. And the German Chancellor got a call at 5 p.m. that he should sort of jump in a plane and come over and sit on that dinner table to just So that was just the first round. The next morning, Macron generously brought Zelensky in his plane to Brussels, where the rest of the European Council, all the prime ministers and presidents met for their regular meeting. And again, you saw a very, very desperate European Union under the rule of the Council President Michel Belge, the former prime minister, who just messed it up, to make it brief. I mean, Zelensky talked to the European Parliament. He gave a speech, and then the council was assembled, and that's all his heads of state and government, and they were basically treated like being at a doctor's place. They got half-hour appointments with Zelensky, one by one or in small groups. It was a huge mess. They were all fed up with it. They were sick and tired of it, but they didn't make use of it. And that's the disappointing or probably even telling message of this encounter, that the European coherence, the show that there is a kind of unity behind all the help for Ukraine, basically backfired. And Zelensky made his point again. He needs more weapons, he needs planes, he thanked everyone, which is necessary. And there was a debate in the evening last night about equipping Ukraine with planes now and with sending much more artillery. Actually, the Baltic countries made suggested that the EU should order ammunition jointly, as they did it with vaccines in the COVID pandemic, because sort of acting as a unified buyer is so much more effective in this highly competed market. And so there seems to be some little advantages of that visit, and seems to be some movement there. But Zelensky went back and basically just proved that the Europeans are not able to bring all their firepower behind one voice or behind one goal. That's basically a much more disappointing message than he brought back from Washington.
Yeah, and I would add, I think that's a great summary and news, because I hadn't heard actually about the Baltic Initiative, which is a good one. Of course, the European Union is funding training, which is important already. So it just makes it more important to do that. It just reinforces this sense of incoherence, which the other message that, of course, Zelensky was bringing is, you promised me to get in the EU. I need to come get into the EU, and not much happening on that score either, as well, right, Stefan?
Well, that's exactly the political talking point number one. He doesn't actually expect it to happen, because he knows his country is at war and the country is not in a state at all to be matching the conditions for being a member of the European Union. Nevertheless, the Commission, and von der Leyen is a huge fan of his, promise to make the assessment of how eligible Ukraine would be for membership by October. So there will be a written report, and council members might decide by December actually already on starting the membership process, which would be extremely fast. I wouldn't give too much hope on that, honestly, because Ukraine has much bigger problems than becoming an EU member right now. It would be a political signal, however. It would tell Putin, well, this is whatever you do, it's not ending in your camp, it's ending in the Western camp. But I guess he knows that already. It doesn't need that membership. And Ukraine already is deeply, deeply intertwined with all things happening in the Western alliances. So yes, we are partners in this, and it's in our interest, in the EU's interest, that the Ukraine will not lose this war, and actually does win it, and will not be taken apart. On the same token, you do get those stories, more and more stories of the bribery issues in Ukraine again, the corruption issues, of big ruptures within the Zelensky administration with competing camps there. So the political part of what's happening in Kiev is coming far stronger to the surface right now. And I wouldn't be surprised if this would engulf us. The longer the year takes and the worse this war goes, the more Ukraine gets under pressure, the more we see the infight, and the more we see the dark sides of Ukraine, and they haven't disappeared.
Giles, looks like this was a twofer for the UK. One, Zelensky went to the UK first, and he had a really good meeting. And then you compare that to what's happening in Europe. I imagine that Prime Minister Sunak feels pretty good about the visit. And the continued effort to say we are actually leading. We're leading not only the Europeans, we're leading the West, including the United States, first on tanks, now on training for pilots. And is that the way to think about what we've been seeing?
It's a way, and if you regard it as a horse race between European powers and Western powers to be seen to be first in line to be helping Ukraine, then yeah, it was a good week for Rishi Sunak and the UK government. But Stefan's portrait of what unfolded in the following 24 hours in Brussels is deeply troubling. At least, however, if a reality check about the extent of unity was required, it was there for all to see. I worry greatly that there is a month or two hence, we're going to look back on this week and realize that we allowed Ukraine to prepare or to face this Russian spring offensive unprepared, when with greater alacrity it could have been avoided, because the scene in Westminster Hall on Wednesday was remarkable. Sun pouring in through those ancient windows, Zelensky standing where Mandela and Obama had stood before, handing a flight helmet to the Speaker of the House of Commons, both houses of Parliament on their feet, roaring their approval. I mean, it was genius from the point of view of raising awareness, raising goodwill for Ukraine on Zelensky's part. But it was also a festival of mutual congratulation, and the British are very prone to that. You're right that on various specific points, the Brits have gone first. And as I understand it, the Challenger 2 tanks will arrive in theatre probably before even the first Leopards, they say now, next month. How many? Very few. There are very few serviceable in the British arsenal. They're old, they're temperamental. I commissioned this morning a piece from one of my colleagues that I hope we can get on how to keep them serviced at the front line. There's going to have to be a hotline back to Salisbury Plain to make that work. And there's a lot of rhetoric this week about British fighter planes being deployed. I mean, all the right-wing press want Typhoons sent over there. We have very few that are serviceable. People who know much more about these things than I say that, in fact, they're not suitable for that theatre, and that it would be most useful, perhaps as a gesture, to goad other powers to make available more suitable planes that can use shorter runways. But big picture, really, really alarming if the offensive really is underway already with up to 300,000 fresh troops. Even though they're conscripts, we've seen their Russian willingness to send in raw conscripts as cannon fodder. We know that the Ukrainian troops on the front line are exhausted. We know that they performed remarkable feats last year. Can they do so again this year after a continuous 12 months of fighting? It's such a shame that it's been left to that.
All good questions. And Bethany, I wonder whether in Beijing, looking at this, this is a crisis that I think Xi Jinping would have loved not to have happen. And at least what the offensive seems to imply is we're going to be living with this war for a lot longer. So how do you think the Chinese are reacting to it? We're also now getting increasing reports about significant Chinese assistance to the Russian war machine. That is also worrisome, something that wasn't the case, or at least didn't appear to be the case in the initial stages of the conflict. Has Xi Jinping just decided he can't afford for Russia to lose, and therefore will try to figure out a way to help him and hopefully at least not lose and perhaps win?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen from China in the past few months is publicly they just don't engage on the Ukraine war very much. In the very beginning, that was right when Xi and Putin had their big summit and all that, and you saw China very publicly trying to say they were not involved, but the West was bad. Now it's mostly just I think that the strategy is just to try to from a Western perspective, try to present China completely out of context of the war. Like, when we talk to you, we'll just pretend the war isn't happening, and just don't think, when you think about the war, don't think about us, and we're not doing anything with it, and just leave us alone, and blah, blah, blah. While meanwhile, what appears, I mean, it's difficult to say, right? There's been some recent reporting from the Wall Street Journal looking at, Chinese state-owned companies, and, some the way that, looking at trade data to see that maybe, China is in some way assisting the Russian war effort, but it's a little bit indirect. So, is that happening, and is that state directed? We're not quite sure, but it seems like it's probably not happening against Xi Jinping's directive. If Xi Jinping were like, we absolutely must not assist Russia in any way, that's probably would not be happening. So, I'd say this is just a continued evolution of the same strategy we've seen from China the whole time, which is they really don't want Russia to lose, but they don't want to sacrifice their own reputation. And with this charm offensive in Europe, China's tried to do this before. To me, it seems like a losing battle. Europe really is, in a lot of ways, not in every way, converging to some extent with the U.S. on their position to China, and I think that is simply a function of just how egregious a lot of China's abuse of the open system is, and they're just really profound threats that they pose to national security and to liberal values, and they just have been quite egregious in the many-fronted war that they kind of wage on that quietly.
Can I ask you a question, Bethany?
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, the Russians announced that Xi Jinping would be coming for a state visit to Moscow. Is this still on? Did you hear anything from the Chinese side?
I have not heard that it's canceled, and I would presume that it's still on. I haven't heard that it's canceled.
Yeah, and I think that's going to take place at the same time as all the other leaders and assembled in Munich for the security conference. The Russians, of course, were not invited, along with the Iranians and the North Koreans. The Chinese are invited to come to Munich, and they will have a delegation there. Interesting to see.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can I ask? Does anyone have any sense of how in the world Brussels is permitting the governor of Xinjiang to go there? Really?
It's announced. Yeah. Let's see.
That's particularly shocking. I agree, and I imagine he's not going to have a speech in front of the European Parliament. That's unlikely. We need to switch over. I just want to put to Giles' very sober analysis on the future of the war. Folks in the U.S., but also in Britain, the UK Ministry of Defense, are doubtful that the Russians actually will have the capacity to really break through the Ukrainian lines in a strategically significant manner, both because the kind of capabilities that they're putting on there are these are young 18-year-olds who don't know how to shoot straight, and they're being used as cannon fodder in many ways. But more importantly, they are running out of ammunition and capabilities to sustain an offensive. So there is a question on whether this, in fact, is going to fundamentally change the nature of the war in a way that clearly a year ago, the beginning of the war, and then the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians is going to have. And if you can sustain the line more or less, then that does provide an opportunity when the armors come in for a Ukrainian offensive to break through, which is exactly what happened in the summer of last year. So we will have to watch this closely. But to Giles's point, I think we will look back at this as we usually do on these crises, that we usually do the right thing. It just takes too long to do it. And as a student of too many of these conflicts, that's usually what happens. And it would be better to have done more early. And to that extent, the UK has been leading on that. Although it's easy to lead when you have nothing or very little. This is the Baltic problem. They want everybody to give weapons, but there's not, they don't have a lot themselves, or the polls for that matter. Giles, let's switch over to the tragedy of the week. If there is a real tragedy, the earthquakes in Turkey that have inflicted so much suffering and pain and loss, not only in Turkey, but in Syria. And people are still looking for survivors. It's too early in some ways to look for recriminations, but one does, politically and otherwise, particularly in Turkey, where an election will be held in just 3 months' time. Bring us up to date about where we are on both of these countries.
Well, we are 5 days after the twin earthquakes. Already the confirmed death toll, 22,000 and counting, is higher than the death toll from the Izmit earthquake of, forgive me, but it's
1999.
1999, the year before the Erdogan era began. And it is unfortunately likely to go on up. This is the most powerful earthquake, or the most destructive pair of earthquakes since Haiti in 2010, which I had to cover from Washington. We went down there, and there's a horrifying familiarity in the pancaked concrete buildings under which so many of the dead have been buried. Earthquakes are not inherently political events, but this pair has become more political than most, because while you can't predict an earthquake, you can prepare and you can respond. And in an earthquake-prone zone, those are very serious responsibilities of leaders. Obviously, all the more so for Erdogan in Turkey, because of Turkey's recent experience of a devastating earthquake just before he had come to power. Key point, 2000, the Turkish parliament passes a swathe of new building codes. From everything that we have read since the earthquakes, that those have been poorly enforced at best. So the shocking video that we have seen of collapsing buildings shows buildings that have one of two things in common. They either predate 2000, or they were not retrofitted. There was no requirement to retrofit. Ultimately, Erdogan may be held responsible for that. There are elements of his response for which he has received praise. Unlike after 1999, he has been swift to accept offers of international help from more than 70 countries. Fortunately, there is a 10,000-foot runway at Adana, which was used by those U-2 planes in the 1960s, which, as I understand it, is one of the main logistics hubs now, which is absolutely critically important when people are trying to fly in from all over the world. Also from Ukraine. I don't know if you noticed this morning, Ukrainian search and rescue crews among those arriving. But the moment of truth, as you suggest, Ivo, will be politically in May, when the presidential and parliamentary elections come. And it remains to be seen two things: whether or not they happen on schedule. It is possible that he will extend a state of emergency and postpone the elections, or they could happen when scheduled. And then it remains to be seen whether in the event 3 months after the earthquakes, his response is seen to have been dynamic and as effective as possible. As we say, he has accepted offers of help. He has mobilized a very large Turkish search and rescue force and medical assistance force, 5,000 doctors and nurses to the affected regions, or whether he is held accountable for those failures to strengthen the built environment of that part of Turkey. You know, there are other places in the world, chief among them Japan perhaps, which show that it can be done, whether he's held responsible for that, and also for some missteps to which he's owned up in the early part of the response, which include, we're told, sort of petty politically partisan moves, such as failing to consult regional leaders because they happen to be from the opposition party. Now, the opposition parties are preparing for this election by forming a united front. They were already, before the earthquakes, to try and unseat Erdogan, who has been there in one capacity or another for nearly 23 years. It'll be very interesting to see how that pans out. I'm not going to try and predict it. You'll recall that the opposition in Hungary last year tried something similar. Orban is still in power over there. So a serious, horrifying tragedy, especially in Turkey in terms of the numbers dead, but also, let's not forget, over the border in northwestern Syria, where access is extremely limited, principally because Russia has used its veto in the UN Security Council repeatedly to keep 2 out of 3 northern crossing points closed. They are, reports from the zone say, reopened. It's unclear how much aid is getting through from the north, what Bashar al-Assad wants is for all aid to the affected area to be directed through Damascus so he can control it. And if we believe some very good reporting in foreign policy, so he can steal from it.
Yeah,
so that is the position. There's very little to be cheerful about.
No, and in Syria, of course, the earthquake affected the area that is still under opposition control. So the only part of Syria still under opposition control, which makes it even more a political football in a way that one would hope with tragedies like this doesn't happen, but it always does. Bethany, quick for you, last time a big earthquake in China happened, we also had a backlash politically because people said, "Where are you?" And you are starting to see reports like that in Turkey. And so, how do you? What do you? It's hard to predict the future. But how do you interpret what's happening? Is that the likely course you're seeing this from going, given the experience that we've seen in other places like China?
I'm not totally sure what you're asking.
So in terms of the growing anger at political authorities for not being able to do basic things like helping to bury people and that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, based on China's experience with the Wenchuan earthquake in 2008, I believe it was. And I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but something like 80,000 people died. And what came out, there were many issues around that, but the biggest one was the issue of corruption in construction, that so many of these buildings, including schools, where the money that was supposed to go into reinforcing them and making them up to code had just disappeared into officials' pockets. And so they had these, they called them tofu buildings, where it's a school with 7 floors and it just went like that and all the children died. And that's why there was such a high death rate. So many children died in that earthquake. And there was a huge political backlash against that. And I mean, in an opaque system, in an authoritarian country, it's hard to know, did that have a real effect? It's hard to have reporting on it. But what we saw a few years later was Xi Jinping coming into power. And the first thing he did was a sweeping anti-corruption campaign that was massively popular, which in his case laid the groundwork for his, later consolidation of power and the rise of a strongman. It's really hard to predict how this plays out, but when you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who've been profoundly affected by an incident like by a tragedy like this, all the other considerations go out the window of, I need stability. I'm not going to push back on politics because I might end up in jail. When you've already lost your children or your cousins or your mother, nothing matters. And it can become very volatile and there can be a ton of pressure, but it's just so hard to say which direction things will go.
Yeah, it's a hard again, it's hard to predict, but it's usually when a crisis happens in the previous administration, the next one tries to fix it. And I think, as Giles rightly said, Erdogan came to power after this, and if after the 1999 earthquake, and if there was no improvement, the ability to withstand criticism is going to be hard to see. We watch it. More importantly, our hearts go out for those who have lost family and friends and who are suffering daily for quite a long time in Turkey and Syria. Unfortunately, we run out of time, so this is it for this week of World Review. I want to thank Bethany and Stefan and Giles for their excellent comments. A programming note: I'm going to take off for the next 3 weeks. I'm out of pocket in New Zealand, but we'll be back 3 weeks from now. But World Review will be back next week. We will have wonderful guest hosts. Please do tune in, continue watching. And in the meantime, until I'm back, bon weekend. Have a wonderful weekend, and see you all very, very soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivo.